Thanks, everyone, for joining us at the Project Censored radio show. We're very glad to welcome to the show Amelia Bonow, who's the co-founder and executive director of Shout Your Abortion, a nationwide organization working to normalize abortion and elevate paths to abortion access regardless of legality. She also proudly serves as the co-chair of the board of directors of Abortion Care Network, a national organization that represents independent abortion providers. Amelia, thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. And full disclosure to folks listening, my abortion story is also on Shout Your Abortion. So I appreciate and really support the work that Shout Your Abortion does, both personally and professionally. So Amelia, start off here. I mean, there are books written about this topic, so I don't mean to ask such a broad question to get started with, but I think people might have a little bit of a vague understanding of some of the absurd restrictions on abortion access outside of the outright ban that happened after Roe v. Wade was overturned. Could you give just a few examples of these like sadistically creative ways in which abortion access is restricted as a part of or instead of an outright ban?
Yeah, so, even before Roe fell, abortion was quite difficult to access for many millions of people. Some of that is just purely logistical. There were like upwards of 95% of counties with not a single clinic. And of course, that number is like in the high 90s now. There are parental notification laws for minors in many states. There are waiting period laws, which are essentially just, especially in states where they know that someone is probably having to travel, for hours, many hours, in order to get to a clinic. They'll make it so that a person has to have an appointment, wait 24 or 48 hours, and then come back for their procedure. So if a person is, working class, they're a parent, they're having to make arrangements in order to like travel hundreds of miles. It's just another way of making the procedure be out of reach. Ultimately, I think it's just important to frame up any conversation like this with the fact that Roe versus Wade was not ever enough. Access has always been out of reach for poor Americans, predominantly Black and Brown Americans, undocumented folks, the same people that this country is always disenfranchising, just really did not ever have easy access to abortion. The first thing that I think made it worse, or the first thing that really undermined the power of Roe was, of course, the Hyde Amendment, which happened just a few years after Roe and made it so that people couldn't use federal insurance to pay for abortion. So like access has always been pay to play. It's not ever just been a right that one could, use if they chose to. It's been a commodity that a person could purchase if they could afford it. And we know that the way that that plays out is racist and classist and just fundamentally unjust.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for framing that in that way, because I think a lot of people feel that if we could just get Roe v. Wade reinstated, then all the problems will be solved, and they were never actually solved in the first place. And I want to get into a bit of a microcosm story here, because in the past month, Louisiana lawmakers who had already made abortion illegal at all stages of pregnancy voted to continue to require child rape victims to carry their pregnancy to term. In other words, children who have been raped have to give birth to children. The legislation was introduced by Representative Delisha Boyd and originally proposed exceptions for rape and incest in general. But when she realized that that bill wouldn't pass, she narrowed it to propose that persons 16 and under could get an abortion if they were victims of rape or incest. And that also failed. Now, I've lost my ability to be shocked, but I never lose my ability to be disgusted. And this remarkably cruel, mentally unhinged, and sadistic legislation is not unique. Some 14 states have outlawed abortion at all stages of pregnancy. Others have banned it after 6 weeks, which, by the way, is before many folks even realize that they're pregnant. So I'm curious, Amelia, do you feel that Louisiana is the most restrictive and most sadistic in terms of abortion care access? Or what states are you watching right now that are pushing to go the same way, or might have already gone this way?
So, when it comes to these just mind-numbingly, as you said, sadistic scenarios like you just described in Louisiana, or something that has no exceptions for rape or incest, or um, you know, I I feel like focusing on I cannot put I have no idea why Republicans from a political standpoint would be trying to do those kinds of things, because obviously, like, we're just seeing affirmed over and over and over again that Americans want abortion access. And this sort of thing is just like such a bad look that I like genuinely don't understand the political calculus. And like from our perspective, it's really easy to get just, as my dad would say, wrapped around the axle about like these insane, sadistic laws. But at the end of the day, any person who is forced to continue a pregnancy, whether they're a child or a well-off adult, whether the sex was consensual or not, any person who is forced even to struggle in order to end a pregnancy, to me, has been utterly disenfranchised by the state, and that is a complete violation of their human rights. And so it's like which state has the worst ban? Well, from ask any of the tens of thousands of people who have either struggled or failed to end a pregnancy in a state with restrictions, they'll probably say theirs is the worst one. You know what I mean? And I think that like I feel the same way about this conversation as I do about like when the left sort of tends to argue for abortion rights on the grounds of like really exceptionally difficult situations, rape, incest, fetal abnormality. That to me is inherently stigmatizing. It's a very, very limited sort of philosophical framework to work from. And ultimately, I want every single person to have access to abortion at any point in their pregnancy, for any time, at any time, for any reason. And that's the goalpost. And arguing for less than that, to me, is part of how we gave the game away a very long time ago.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think we can oftentimes veer into this kind of like trauma porn space,
Yeah, totally.
and forget that if you want to have an abortion, it's really nobody's business as to why or like what the specifics are. If you choose to share it, like I think like the platform like Shout Your Abortion, I think did a lot of things for people because it made it when people would sometimes feel guilt, like, well, I just want an abortion because I don't want a child. Is that a good enough
Mm-hmm.
reason? And then this platform shared so many of those stories, like, I just don't want a kid and I shouldn't have to have one. It's like, oh, okay, I
Right,
don't have to have been through like this horrific situation. I can just not want it.
right,
And
right,
that's
right.
okay. That's enough.
Like not wanting a child is an inherently excellent reason to have an abortion. My abortion actually happened 10 years ago yesterday. And my me speaking out about my own experience was like the catalyst for this whole hashtag and outpouring of tens of thousands, I don't know, maybe hundreds of thousands of stories at this point. And it was really interesting because like my experience it was positive. It was galvanizing in a positive way. I was so aware of how lucky I was, and I was so angry thinking about how many people were not lucky. And I was so grateful for the people who took care of me. And I also was sort of aware that like the goodness, the profound goodness of their work was like kind of a secret. And ultimately, I just felt this just intense level of relief that ultimately was like it was like a celebration. Like I was like, oh my God, I don't have to become a parent. Like it was just it felt good in the way that autonomy feels good, and in the way that being supported by, you know, people who are like, I believe in you to make choices, and like, I'm going to help you live your best life. It was a galvanizing experience in all of those ways. And I sort of realized that like, I never heard people talk about it that way, you know, and that like the vast majority of stories that I'd ever heard referenced were generally like, if they weren't just a huge bummer, they were at the very least sort of prefaced with like, I wasn't in a good relationship. I wanted to finish school. I didn't have money. And I didn't want to do any of that exactly because of what you just said. Like the reason was that I didn't want to have a kid. And that to me was like so inherently, it was like so self-justifying. So when I spoke about my own experience in a way that was just like not buffered by rationalizations or like any kind of tragedy. And it was in fact just me celebrating having had this access and the people who took care of me. I think that like that was part of the reason why it felt like a novel. People just I think weren't really used to hearing that. And for the first like few years, the most common thing that people would always say to me was like, oh my God, I didn't feel bad. I never felt bad, but I like felt bad that I didn't feel bad. And I think that now SYA and a lot of other similar projects like have done a lot of space has opened up that just wasn't there before, and it's now quite common. You know, like if I was talking to you 10 years ago and you just casually mentioned that you had shared your abortion, I think that most listeners would be like, oh, wow, Eleanor had an abortion. Now people don't give a shit. I guarantee you. Most of the people listening to this show already forgot that you had an abortion. And because it's just very common to hear people talk about their reproductive lives and abortion being a part of that. 10 years ago or 9 years ago now, I was on the front page of the New York Times for talking about my abortion. That's wild. That's wild. And that will never happen again. So, like, that's progress. And it's also like, it's part of the reason why I feel hopeful in a long game kind of way, because, like, you can't put this back in the bag.
Mm-mm.
People actually have abortions, all kinds of people, all day, every day, for every kind of reason, of all political stripe. It just happens. And most people feel deeply okay with it. And we're coming around to see that voters feel deeply horrified at the way that the right is, just like doing this horrific minority rule. It's just this issue is being legislated and being, dealt with in the courts in a way that's just like so out of step with how people actually feel, what they want, what they need in terms of healthcare. And it's not going to work out well for them, you know?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, you touched on so many good things, but I think one of them is also like it's creating threads to other conversations like, okay, well, we don't have access to abortion. Why don't we have access to healthcare in general?
Yeah,
Because if we're
right?
agreeing that that's part of healthcare, then why can't I go to a doctor when I need to? Why aren't teeth considered part of my body? Like,
Yeah.
why? And I
Yeah.
think another offshoot of that I feel like personally really is really important because now I do have a child, and I felt that I would never have a child unless I could answer the question, why do you want a child? Because I
Hmm.
feel like so often the question is, why don't you want kids? And I got so tired of answering that question. It's like, shouldn't we flip it? Because you make it sound like it's, oh, why don't you want a bicycle? It's like, this is a life that I'm bringing into the
Totally.
world. Like, it's not like, why don't you want to try paddleboarding? Like, this is a
Yeah.
serious
Right.
conversation. I feel like that is also shifting a little bit where people are having a lot of more deeper and important conversations about, okay, but do I want a kid? Not why don't I? And I think that's really powerful and important as well. And I want to talk a little bit about SYA in particular because it's such a rad platform for a lot of different resources for folks. But I'm also curious, because the issue is regardless of legality, where do y'all fit? I mean, are you like the modern day outlaws? Like, here's how you access this increasingly impossible healthcare?
Um, we, you know, laws are not a description of what is moral or what is possible. And we are really committed to helping people understand what their options are, no matter what the law says. And thankfully, because of so let me back up. There's been some really interesting research post-Dobbs. We're now almost 2 years out from the Dobbs decision. Like you said, we've had 14 states pass total bans, 7 states severely restrict abortion. And what is completely fascinating is that the abortion rate has not dropped. Now, simultaneously, the birth rate in deeply red states has increased in a way that makes us know that some people, of course, the most marginalized people in this country, are giving birth to babies that they did not want, to pregnancies that they could not find a way to end. But simultaneously, because abortion pills by mail have become so much more widely available due to sort of this like convalescing bunch of factors that was COVID and telemedicine advancements and FDA relaxing in-person prescription requirements, and all of these activist networks, both in the States and overseas, getting teed up for this to happen and creating networks of distribution, both above and below ground. Pills are now very, very widely available by mail in all 50 states, and hundreds of thousands of people have used abortion pills to safely end their pregnancy since the Dobbs decision, many of whom did so in restricted states. So the combination of the increased availability of pills and also just, I think, activists who work for abortion funds and practical support organizations and independent clinics who are just fighting tooth and nail to expand their services and their capacity in blue states and work to get patients there who need to be seen for an in-clinic procedure. Like, really, this just constellation of relentless freedom fighters, really, like have been working around the clock to build this decentralized, sort of cobbled together system of access. And what we're seeing is that it's working. So like, it's kind of good news and bad news. The bad news is, of course, that like some people are falling through the cracks, right? And we don't even know how many, because like generally the people who fall through the cracks are so deeply marginalized that they are probably invisible to, you know, the people that are trying to look for that data and to society in general. And that is so heartbreaking, and it's absolutely, it means that we have to continue pushing more into the most marginalized places. But also what we're seeing from this data is that all of us working together have the power to undermine the impact of abortion bans, and that the law does not have to determine whether or not we have access to abortion, and that we can go out and say, guess what? No matter where you live, you still have options. And we will be saying that all day, every day, forever. Like, we want people to know that, you know, I think that culture has like a really back alley abortion, like illegal, unsafe abortion from the previous, before Roe era, I think caused a major like cultural trauma sort of stain on our collective memory. And one thing that SYA really wants to work on changing is helping people to understand that like they can have a safe abortion in a state with an abortion ban. And there are people and organizations out there who are going to help you know exactly how to do that, with support from, medical hotlines and funding and emotional support and just like people surrounding you and helping you through it. And we're going to keep doing that no matter what. Like that's just that.
Yeah, absolutely. And I'm so glad that there are folks out there doing that work. And I'm curious, kind of looking at it from the other side too, because I understand and I've read that some doctors and some abortion care providers are afraid, not just because of their own personal safety, like being attacked by extremists, but also being fined, being put in jail. For instance,
Yeah.
I'm in Maryland, so there are so-called shield laws, the
Mm-hmm.
laws that protect abortion providers from investigations from other states. But like this is a
Mm-hmm.
thing, like they're going after doctors, which feels so remarkably dystopian. I mean,
Yeah,
all of this does, but
totally.
like could you talk a little bit about like looking at abortion care from the side of the provider and like
Yeah.
how things are scary on that side as well?
Yeah. So, I mean, first off, like as you said, um, beyond being afraid of like legal consequences or being disbarred or whatever, the anti-choice movement has murdered 11 people since 1994, and every provider that I know faces constant harassment and is targeted. People are targeted in their homes. People are terrorized for doing this work. And I have such deep respect and admiration and love for abortion providers. And I want to specifically shout out independent abortion providers. Most people, when we think of providers, we think of Planned Parenthood. That's where I got my abortion. They provide tons of excellent healthcare, but indie providers are really like, they are the unsung, chronically undersupported. They're indies. They're like indie anything. They're like just a small group of people in a little building, just like with no security system and no, like big fundraising or communications apparatus, just like making it happen. And these guys are very often the last clinics hanging on in hostile states. They are the folks that do the vast majority, almost 100% of care later in pregnancy. And they just need to be like explicitly named because they need folks' support. And if people are curious, they can go to abortioncarenetwork.org to learn more about the indies in their area and how to support them. But yeah, so as you said, like there is a lot of apprehension from providers in terms of like being, you don't see people stepping out and doing like conscientious objection or sort of the best example I think of this is SB8, which hit the books like what, a year before Roe. And SB8 was wildly unconstitutional, right? And it also effectively ended in clinic access to abortion in the state of Texas while Roe versus Wade was still intact. And that was ultimately, to be frank, it was because um, the big organizations in the repro landscape that would have had the institutional power to mount a coordinated like challenge to this, or like a we're doing it anyway kind of approach, they're all lawyered up. The big orgs, just like everywhere else, are all lawyered up, and lawyers are risk averse in this line of work because what we're doing, we're in a totally unprecedented situation, right? And all of these laws are like they're made up, they're unconstitutional, they're like there's no precedent for how they'll be interpreted because people are just like throwing stuff at the wall. And ultimately, I want to say that I do not expect any provider, let alone a provider in Texas, like I don't expect any individual to like go put, I'm not trying to set this up as like some moral imperative, like you should go do this. But I would love to see providers who are, towards the end of their career, They're people of privilege. They're people with a lot of institutional power. They're people who practice in blue states, maybe. Go down to Texas and go perform some abortions and break the system. We simply cannot just comply, all of us, right? And like, obviously, I'm an activist. I'm in a totally different situation. I don't have a medical license. I don't have a family to feed. And again, I'm not trying to say like, this is what any one person should do, but you're totally correct that like in broad strokes, we are not seeing the medical establishment push back and challenge what are ultimately like illegal laws. Like SB 8 is an illegal law. It ended abortion access before, while the federal right to abortion access was still intact. And it's because people caved, and that is devastating.
Yeah, absolutely. And it speaks to the importance of activism being not something that you just see people doing like on a street, but activism is something that we have to do in whatever spaces we find ourselves in, whatever professions. Um, so Amelia, I mean, we could talk for days about this, and I would love to, but I want to get with the time we have left, I want to talk a little bit about specifically with Shout Your Abortion, like because it seems to be one of like the loudest and most unapologetic places for people to go and to have access to information about abortion. So if hypothetically, if I'm a person in a state that has a total ban on abortions and I need help, what would be like your, I guess, order of operations in terms of finding what to do?
Um, I mean, so if you go to SYA's website and you go to our resources page, we have uh, kind of the resources to support someone who just needs information about sort of their range of options. We have information about how to find pills, how to use pills at home safely, how to find funding, how to find emotional and medical support. Um, and if you are a person who is in a red state and you're pregnant and you don't want to be, the main thing I want to say is you will always have options. And it kind of just depends whether you want to try to leave the state and have an in-clinic procedure, or you want to receive pills by mail and have an abortion at home, which again is super safe, super effective. And it's all possible. So I would say go to our resources page, and I want to, going back to the thing that you just said, like that we all can be activists in different, I forget what you just said, but basically like I see this moment that we're in as somewhat post-institutional, right? Like we're no longer in a world where, okay, I'm pregnant, I can just like go to a doctor's office and get what I need. And we're no longer in a place where like the law about what I'm allowed to do with my body corresponds with what I want to and am going to do with my body. And in the same way, like the ways to get involved, I think, and actively work in support of abortion access, or even to just like help push this conversation forward about the fact that like you can still have an abortion no matter what the law says. There are resources, there are people to help you. Here's where to start. Everyone can do that. Like this is no longer, I think that for a very long time, people, reproductive rights supporters, thought what I do to be a supporter is to write a check to probably a big national organization or to a candidate, and vote blue and whatever. At the end of the day, none of those things prevented this current situation from happening. Really, the elected Dems are not offering. I want to see so much more from them. And like at the end of the day, there are so many ways for people to just decide to be part of the solution and find a way to plug in. And I think that if you go to SYA's website and sort of just mess around, like you'll find something that might inspire you to go have a conversation, go put up a poster, go just learn more about what the post-Dobbs access landscape looks like, and learn how to make yourself a resource for that information, and become a person in your community who people know they can turn to for help. To me, that's the like baseline of like being a supporter of abortion access, is like knowing how to do it and sharing that information with people who need it. So yeah, in some ways it's like there's kind of a lot more, like I reject the idea. I'm of course horrified at the legal landscape and at the fact that like our rights have been negated. And I also was never asking these people for permission. And I don't respect the authority or the legitimacy of this court, and I refuse to comply. And for the rest of my life, I will work to engender a culture of defiance and of people who understand how to circumvent and just fully break the law, if that's what they want to do, in order to live free in their bodies and exercise their autonomy. So I'm very undeterred, and I'm mad, but we're going to do it no matter what. So I think that that's a hopeful place to, for people who are used to thinking about this as like a political battle for rights that we are losing. I encourage you to reorient yourself in this place of, yeah, that's really messed up, and we have to fight. We have to continue fighting this out electorally in the courts, et cetera, because criminalization is bad, and that will happen, and it will happen to the most marginalized people. But in the meantime, we're not waiting around and asking anybody for permission. We're doing it anyway. There's safe ways to do it. There are people everywhere who are part of this new system of abortion access, and you can be one of them.
Beautifully put. And I think what's so powerful about that too is that I think the conversation again is shifted. Like when I had my abortion, it was, you'll never stop people from having abortions. You'll just stop them from having safe and accessible abortions. And now it's like, you'll never stop people from having abortions. Also, you can have safe and effective abortions at home.
Yes,
Like,
exactly. Yeah,
so
totally. And
it's
that's a lot of like what we want to encourage people to do, is sort of the idea of safety and legality are like so intertwined. And it's just no longer the case. You know what I mean? And like, and that said, I do think that like the idea of struggling to end a pregnancy, like it's not, sometimes the stats are talked about as if like, oh, if that person was able to like leave a red state and ultimately access care, you know, weeks later in some other state for thousands of dollars, and like that's not okay. And that's like a level of struggle that can change and derail a life. I mean, you know, as someone who's been pregnant, it's like that is I really worry for, I worry for activists and folks who are working for abortion funds, for example, people who are like working directly with patients and clients all day long, and like the vicarious trauma that is being absorbed and held. And I worry for people who are struggling to access care, even if they ultimately do. That's not enough. And I think that you know, it's a good time to shout out, like, support your local abortion fund. If you do have money to kick somewhere, that's a great place to do that, because there's definitely been like a drop off of like post-Dobbs rage donations. And this current, you know, like this current like network that I'm describing in intentionally very like hopeful terms, and I do feel hopeful about it, but like it's not sustainable, both in terms of human beings working for doing this kind of work, and also financially. So we need more folks, we need more hands on deck, you know. We need more folks to understand that this is abortion is a community responsibility. can have it to the degree that we work to make it happen. And it's on all of us. And yeah, it's stressful. We can do it, but we like need more participation.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you pointed out, it's not like it's not this crazy taboo thing. Like everybody knows somebody's had an abortion. So it's like we walk
Yeah,
amongst you.
yeah, yeah,
So
yeah.
well, Amelia, thank you so much again for taking the time to sit down with us and really especially offer some different perspectives to what we so often hear about. Um, again, Shout Your Abortion is where folks can find all of this information. Is there anywhere else that you'd like to shout out for folks to check out?
Um, I would encourage people to follow the Abortion Care Network. If you want to support independent clinics, you can go to keepourclinics.org. And yeah, you can follow my personal Instagram if you'd like. I'm at Amelia Maris. And yeah, thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. And thanks for shouting your abortion.
Well, thank you for providing the platform for me to do so.